In a small lakeside community, nestled away from the hustle of the city, life seemed peaceful and calm. The houses were large, sprawling estates, each with a clear view of the lake, a beautiful body of water that reflected the ever-changing sky. The people who lived here enjoyed their serene surroundings. They liked to boast about the exclusivity of their neighborhood and often gathered at weekend events by the water. For most, the lake was not just a beautiful sight. It was a place to fish, kayak, and enjoy quiet afternoons under the sun. Among the homes lining the shores, one house stood out. It was not the largest or the flashiest, but it had an air of mystery about it. Hidden behind tall trees, the house was barely visible from the main road, and its property stretched all the way to the edge of the lake. The owner of this house, a man who had recently moved to the area, kept to himself. His name was never mentioned at social gatherings, and few knew much about him at all. He didn't seem interested in the usual neighborhood gossip or activities. Some thought he was just a quiet, private person. Others whispered that there was more to him than met the eye. This man, though relatively unknown to the community, was the actual owner of the lake. Years ago, before most of the people here had moved in, he had purchased the land surrounding the lake. He had kept his ownership quiet, not wanting to stir up attention. He wasn't interested in flaunting wealth or power. He just wanted to live in peace and enjoy his property. Every morning he would spend time on the lake, boating by himself, enjoying the solitude that the water provided. It was his escape, his sanctuary from the world. He didn't mind the occasional boaters or fishers who visited the lake. But over the years he began to notice more and more people from the neighborhood using the lake for their own leisure. At first he didn't care. It was public property after all. Or at least that's what the people in the neighborhood believed. They had no idea that it was privately owned. As the years went by, the quiet man's patience began to wear thin. The local fishing club, in particular, began to take liberties with his property. They would leave trash by the water, disrupt the wildlife, and make a mess. He didn't want to be a troublemaker, so he let it slide. He figured that it wasn't worth the drama. However, things were about to change. The moment came one sunny afternoon when a woman from the neighborhood, someone everyone knew well, decided to approach him about a matter she was deeply concerned about. Her name was Karen. Karen was the kind of person who didn't mind stepping on others to get what she wanted. She had been a prominent figure in the local HOA for years and made it her mission to ensure everyone followed the rules, whether they wanted to or not. She prided herself on keeping the community in check, even if it meant causing a little bit of tension along the way. To her, rules were everything, and everyone had to abide by them, no exceptions. It was a typical afternoon when Karen spotted the man's boat docked near the lake's entrance. It wasn't a big boat, but it was enough to block access for other residents who wanted to use the area. Karen saw this as a problem. After all, the HOA had clear rules about where boats could be docked. According to the rules, boats needed to be kept at designated areas, not just left anywhere along the shore. Without thinking too much about it, Karen marched down to the man's house ready to make her case. She didn't know who he was, other than that he had recently moved into the house with the tall trees. She assumed he was just another resident, one who didn't fully understand the HOA's strict guidelines. When she reached his property, she noticed him sitting on the porch enjoying a cup of coffee and watching the water. She walked right up to him, confident that she would get him to move his boat without any issue. "Excuse me," she called out as she approached. He looked up, his calm expression giving away little. "I'm Karen from the HOA," she said, almost as if introducing herself was a badge of honor. "I couldn't help but notice your boat is docked right by the entrance. It's causing some problems for the other residents who want to access the lake." The man set down his cup of coffee, standing up slowly. "I'm sorry, but what's the problem?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Karen crossed her arms and gave him a look of authority. "The HOA has clear rules about where boats can be docked. This area is not for private use, and by leaving your boat here, you're blocking access to others." He paused for a moment, looking at her. "I see. And who exactly enforces these rules?" "The HOA does," Karen replied confidently. "And as a member of the board, I'm the one who has to make sure everyone follows them. So I'm going to need you to move that boat. Now." The man stared at her for a moment, clearly unbothered by her demands. "I'm not sure you understand," he said calmly. "I don't have to move my boat." Karen's eyebrows furrowed. "Excuse me?" she asked, not sure if she had heard him correctly. I don't have to move it, he repeated. I have every right to dock it here if I choose. Karen, now annoyed by his resistance, stepped forward. You're breaking the rules and I'm telling you to move it. If you don't, I'll file a formal complaint with the HOA and you'll be hearing from them. The man looked at her and then glanced down at his boat. There was a long pause before he spoke again. I own this lake, he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. You own the lake? She asked, skeptical. Yes, he replied. I own the lake, the land around it, and this property. The HOA's rules don't apply to me when it comes to the lake. The words hung in the air for a moment. Karen didn't know how to respond. She had been certain that she was in the right, that she had the authority to enforce the rules, but now she was faced with the shocking revelation that the very land she thought she was protecting didn't belong to her or anyone in the community at all. It was the man's property. He didn't owe anyone an explanation. Karen's face reddened, her pride stung by the unexpected turn of events. She stammered for a moment but couldn't come up with a retort. Her mind was racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. The man owned the lake and, by extension, the very place she had always felt so comfortable asserting her authority. The encounter between the man and Karen left both of them in an awkward silence. Karen stood there for a moment, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, unsure of what to do next. Her entire sense of control had been shaken by the man's calm declaration that he owned the lake. She had spent years enforcing the rules of the HOA, believing that she had the power to make everyone comply. And now here was this stranger, casually dismissing her authority. It wasn't just the boat that bothered her. It was the audacity of this man to challenge her in front of her own neighborhood. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Karen forced a tight smile. I don't think you understand, she said, trying to regain some semblance of control. Even if you own the lake, there are still rules for everyone in this community. The HOA works to keep things organized, and we have certain standards that need to be followed. You can't just do whatever you want. The man, who had been quietly observing her, shook his head slowly. I understand what you're saying, but the HOA's rules don't apply to me when it comes to my lake. I own this property, and I'm not interested in following rules that don't concern me. The boat is fine where it is. It doesn't bother anyone. Karen's cheeks flushed with frustration. She was not used to being ignored, especially by someone she considered an outsider. He might have owned the lake, but that didn't mean he could just brush aside everything she had worked so hard to establish. In her mind, this was more than just a simple disagreement about a boat. This was about authority, control, and respect. You're making a mistake, Karen insisted, her voice a little sharper than before. People rely on the HOA to make sure everyone is following the same rules. You can't just expect to do whatever you want and get away with it. The man looked at her with a calmness that only seemed to annoy her further. I'm not trying to break any rules, I'm just living my life. I'll keep the boat where it is. If that bothers you, I'm sure we can work something out, but I'm not moving it. Karen clenched her fists at her sides, feeling her patience slipping away. She had never been in a situation like this before. She was used to being the one who held the power, the one who made decisions for the community. But here, in this moment, she felt like she was the one losing control. I'll be reporting this to the HOA, she said through gritted teeth. You'll hear from them soon. The man simply nodded. I'm sure I will, he replied, his tone still as even and composed as ever. Karen stood there for a moment, glaring at him. She had hoped that her stern words would make him back down, but instead it seemed to have the opposite effect. The man wasn't afraid of her or the HOA. He wasn't afraid of anything. For the first time in a long while, Karen felt powerless. As she turned to leave, she muttered under her breath, You'll regret this. The man didn't respond, watching her walk away. He wasn't concerned. He had no intention of changing his ways for anyone, especially not someone like Karen, who seemed to think that she could dictate how others lived their lives. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Back at her house, Karen wasted no time in gathering her thoughts. She immediately began drafting an official complaint to the HOA, outlining the violation of the lake's usage and insisting that the man's boat be moved immediately. She knew that if anyone could make him comply, it was the HOA. They had dealt with difficult situations before, and they would deal with this one as well. At least that's what she hoped. The next morning, Karen sent off her complaint. Within hours, she received a response from the HOA board, agreeing to look into the matter. She was pleased to see that her efforts were being taken seriously. Soon, She would be back in control. As the days passed, Karen watched the man from her window, observing him as he went about his daily routine. He was always on the lake, either on his boat or walking along the shore. The more she watched, the more unsettled she became. He didn't seem concerned about the complaint at all. In fact, it was as if he hadn't even heard her. That only made her more determined to push forward with her plan. It wasn't long before the HOA sent a representative to the man's house to address the issue. Karen knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. She eagerly anticipated the confrontation that would surely follow. Finally, the man would have to answer for his actions. But when the HOA representative arrived, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Karen had been expecting the representative to demand that the boat be moved immediately. Instead, she overheard part of their conversation from her window. The man was calm, confident, and polite as he spoke with the representative. He wasn't defensive or aggressive, just matter-of-fact about his rights as the property owner. "I understand the HOA has rules for the neighborhood," the man said, "but the lake is my property, and I don't have to follow those rules when it comes to how I use it. I'll cooperate in other ways, but the boat stays." The HOA representative seemed taken aback at first, but then asked a few questions about the man's ownership of the lake. After a brief pause, the representative quietly acknowledged that the man had every right to keep his boat wherever he wanted. The HOA had no authority over the lake itself. In the end, the representative apologized for any confusion and promised to get back to Karen with an update. Karen's heart sank as she realized that the man's claims were legitimate. He really did own the lake, and the HOA had no power over it. It was a humbling moment for her, one that she hadn't expected. She had spent so much time trying to control every aspect of the community, and now this stranger had just exposed the limits of her authority. She was furious, but she also felt a little embarrassed. How had she allowed herself to be so easily caught up in this? She had underestimated the man, assuming that because he was new to the area, he didn't understand how things worked. Now he was the one with all the power, and she was left scrambling to regain control. Karen didn't give up, though. She wasn't one to let a setback stop her, especially when it came to matters of authority. But this situation was proving more complicated than she had anticipated. She knew that if she wanted to keep her position in the community, she had to find a way to regain the upper hand. And soon, she began making phone calls to other HOA members trying to rally support for her cause. But to her surprise, many of them weren't as eager to back her up as she had hoped. Some didn't see the point in confronting the man, while others seemed to think that his ownership of the lake wasn't such a big deal. They all pointed out that the man had every right to use his property as he pleased. Karen was starting to feel isolated. She had always been the one to make things happen in the neighborhood, but now she found herself on the outside, struggling to convince others that she was right. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control of the situation. As the days went by, Karen realized that this wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about her place in the community and her sense of power, and she wasn't ready to let go of that just yet. The days after the HOA representative had visited the man's property felt like an eternity to Karen. She couldn't shake the sense of defeat that had settled over her. It was one thing to argue with someone and lose, but it was another thing entirely to discover that the person you were up against had far more power than you had ever imagined. It made her feel small in a way that she wasn't used to, but more than that, it stirred something deeper within her, a need to reclaim control. She had spent the past several years building her position in the community, making sure the rules were followed and ensuring everything was just as it should be. But now everything was uncertain. The man who had seemed so inconspicuous when he moved in was turning out to be the one with all the cards. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about the power dynamics in the entire neighborhood. And Karen wasn't ready to let go of her position without a fight. She sat in her living room, a mug of coffee resting untouched on the table before her. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a new plan. She couldn't afford to let this man win, not after everything she had worked for. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like this man was testing her, daring her to step up and challenge him. But what if he didn't care about the community the way she did? What if he just wanted to live in peace and didn't understand the importance of maintaining order? He might own the lake, but that didn't mean he could ignore the rest of the neighborhood. It was then that Karen remembered something something that had always worked in her favor before. Public opinion. The other residents of the neighborhood were, for the most part, decent people. They cared about keeping things nice, about following the rules, and about maintaining the image of the community. If she could just make them see that the man's actions were a threat to that image, they would support her. She wasn't going to let him come in and wreck the harmony of the place. With a new sense of determination, Karen made up her mind. She would rally the neighbors. She would talk to them, make them understand that the lake and everything around it was part of their shared community. If she could get them on her side, maybe, just maybe, she could pressure the man into moving his boat and following the HOA's rules. But first, she needed more information. She needed to know exactly what she was up against. Karen had never been one to back down easily, and this time would be no different. She had to be prepared. The next day, she decided to pay the man a visit. She had thought about confronting him directly before, but now she realized that it was the right moment to approach him with more tact. She needed to be calm, collected, and persuasive. There was no room for error. When Karen arrived at his house, she was surprised to find him outside, sitting on the porch with a book in hand. He looked up as she approached, his expression friendly but unreadable. He didn't seem shocked to see her, as if he had been expecting it all along. "Good afternoon," Karen said, trying to sound cordial. "I wanted to talk to you again about the boat." The man nodded, setting his book aside. "I'm listening." "I understand that you own the lake," she said, her voice steady. "But I still believe that we should all be following the same rules here. The HOA is in place to ensure that everyone is treated fairly, and I don't think that's too much to ask." The man leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "I've already explained that the lake is my property. I have every right to use it as I see fit." "I get that," Karen replied, "but the rest of us rely on the HOA to maintain order. If one person gets to ignore the rules, it sets a bad precedent. It's about fairness, about everyone having equal access and respect for the shared spaces." The man didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, his expression neutral. Karen couldn't tell what he was thinking, and that only made her feel more frustrated. She needed him to understand that she wasn't just some busybody trying to enforce arbitrary rules. This was about the entire community. She had to make him see that. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Karen continued. "I just want us all to follow the same guidelines. We're all here for the same reason, to enjoy the lake, to enjoy this neighborhood. But that can only happen if we all respect each other's space." The man took a deep breath, clearly weighing her words. After a long pause, he spoke. "I don't have a problem with the community," he said slowly. "But I can't agree to follow rules that don't apply to me. The lake is mine, Karen. I'm not going to change that." The use of her name, calm and deliberate, made her feel like he was trying to show her some kind of respect. But the words also stung. She wasn't just Karen to him. She was someone who worked hard to keep things in order, someone who had earned her position in the community. This man didn't understand the effort it took to keep everything running smoothly. "I understand that you own the lake," Karen said, her voice tight. "But that doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want. The HOA is about maintaining a sense of fairness, and whether you like it or not, this community expects us all to follow the same rules." There was a long silence as the man looked at her, and for a moment, Karen wondered if she had pushed too hard. But then he spoke again, his tone softer this time. "I'm not trying to be unfair, Karen, but you have to understand that my property is mine. I can't let anyone tell me how to use it. I'll follow the rules that affect the community, but the lake is something else." Karen didn't know what to say. She was so used to winning, to being the one who made decisions, and kept things in line. This man's indifference to her authority was unsettling, but it also sparked something inside her. Maybe she hadn't fully realized it until now, but there was more to this than just the lake or even the boat. This was about control, about who had the power to decide how things were run. "I don't think you understand the position you're putting us in," Karen said, her voice firm. "This community won't stand for someone who refuses to follow the rules. And if you keep ignoring the HOA, there will be consequences." The man raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained calm. "I'm not worried about the consequences. I'm just trying to live my life." Karen's frustration grew, but she knew she couldn't let it show. "We all want to live our lives," she replied. "But it's about respecting the people around you. If you don't do that, things will start to fall apart." "I respect the people around me," the man said. But I'm not going to change how I use my property just to appease others. Karen stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. She had hoped that this conversation would go differently, that she could convince him to at least meet her halfway. But now she realized that he wasn't going to back down. And for the first time in a long while, Karen felt like she had met her match. The days after Karen's last confrontation with the man passed slowly, and each day, Karen's resolve to push him into compliance seemed to grow stronger. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside her. She could no longer accept that this stranger, who had barely been in the community for more than a few months, could simply ignore the rules and expect everyone else to follow them. The fact that he owned the lake only seemed to fuel her sense of injustice. How could one person have so much power and control, while everyone else was bound by the same set of rules? She couldn't let this go. She had always been a fighter, a woman who would do whatever it took to protect her community. This was no different. If the HOA wasn't going to do anything about it, then it was up to her to find a way to get the man to follow the rules. No matter how much he resisted, Karen spent the next few days going over the HOA's documents with a fine-tooth comb. She studied the rules and regulations, looking for any loopholes that might work in her favor. There had to be something, some clause that could help her get him to comply. But every time she thought she had found something, it turned out to be irrelevant to the situation at hand. The more she dug, the more frustrated she became. The man's defiance seemed to cut deeper than she had expected. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about his complete disregard for the authority she had worked so hard to maintain. He wasn't just challenging her, he was challenging everything she stood for. And that made her angrier than she cared to admit. She had always been the one people turned to for answers, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. This man was shaking that sense of control, and she wasn't going to let that happen. One evening, after another long day of fruitless attempts to find a solution, Karen sat down at her kitchen table, her mind racing. She couldn't keep going in circles. She needed a new approach, something that would force the man to see that he couldn't just do as he pleased. But what? What could she do that would make him understand the importance of playing by the rules? It was then that the idea hit her. A plan so simple yet so powerful. If the man refused to acknowledge the HOA's authority, maybe she could make him feel the weight of his actions in a different way. She had to make him understand that his refusal to comply affected more than just him. It affected the entire community. The next morning, Karen set her plan in motion. She called a meeting with the HOA board members, explaining her concerns and outlining her new idea. To her surprise, they agreed to support her. They weren't thrilled about the situation, but they understood that something needed to be done. They knew that Karen was persistent, and they trusted her judgment. Over the next few days, Karen worked behind the scenes, contacting the members of the local fishing club, whose members frequently used the lake. She explained the situation to them, emphasizing that the man's actions were threatening the community's shared use of the lake. She told them that their fishing privileges could be at risk if the man wasn't made to understand the importance of following the HOA's guidelines. Most of the members were hesitant at first, but Karen's persuasive argument slowly won them over. They agreed to support her cause. As the days went by, Karen's plan began to take shape. She wasn't just going to confront the man anymore. She was going to make his life uncomfortable in a way he couldn't ignore. The next step was to hold a community meeting. This meeting would bring together all the residents who used the lake, and Karen would make sure that everyone knew exactly what was at stake. When the day of the meeting arrived, Karen felt a surge of anticipation. She had done everything she could to get the community on her side, and now it was time to put everything into motion. She had a feeling that the man wouldn't show up to the meeting, but she didn't care. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about sending a message to everyone who lived in the neighborhood. The meeting was held at the community center, and it was packed. Karen stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the crowd. People were talking in hushed voices, exchanging glances, and wondering what the meeting was about. When Karen stepped up to the podium, the room went silent. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady and strong. "We're here today because of one person's actions that have affected all of us. We've all enjoyed using the lake, whether it's for fishing, kayaking, or just relaxing by the water. But one resident has decided that the rules don't apply to him. He believes that he can do whatever he wants with the lake, because he owns it. But that's not how things work in this community." Karen paused, letting her words sink in. She could see the murmurs rippling through the room. People were starting to understand. They were starting to see the bigger picture. The HOA was created to make sure that everyone is treated fairly, she continued. That means we all follow the same rules. If one person is allowed to break those rules, it sets a dangerous precedent for all of us. If we let him get away with this, what's next? Who's to say that other people won't start ignoring the rules too? Karen could feel the tension in the room, but she pressed on. She wasn't going to back down now. We've already spoken to the man who owns the lake. He's refused to cooperate, so now we have to make a decision. We're not going to let one person ruin the harmony of this community. That's why we've come up with a solution. We've spoken to the fishing club and we've agreed that the lake will no longer be available for recreational use unless the man agrees to move his boat and follow the rules of the HOA. A gasp went through the room. Karen had expected this reaction, but it still felt good to see the shock on their faces. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. This was about showing the man that his actions had consequences. We need to stand together on this, Karen said, her voice rising with emotion. If we let him get away with this, we're allowing him to disrespect all of us. We cannot let that happen. The room was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, one by one, people began to nod in agreement. Karen could see the shift in the room. She had rallied them together and they were with her now. After the meeting, Karen felt a sense of victory, but it was tempered with uncertainty. She had done everything she could to make the community see the importance of standing up to the man's defiance. But now, she had to wait and see how he would respond. She knew that the ball was in his court, but she also knew that the community was behind her. If he didn't comply, the consequences would be clear. The fishing club would be banned from using the lake, and the community would no longer tolerate his behavior. Karen was confident that this would make him reconsider his position. But as she left the meeting, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. She had no idea how the man would react, but she was ready to face whatever came next. The days after the community meeting felt like a turning point. Karen couldn't help but feel a surge of anticipation, mixed with nervous energy. She had done everything she could to bring the neighborhood together, to show them that the man's refusal to follow the HOA's rules wasn't just a personal matter. It was about the larger community, about fairness and about the integrity of their shared spaces. Now, it was in the hands of the man. He had heard the message loud and clear, and the question was, would he comply, or would he continue to push back? Karen didn't have to wait long for his response. It came 2 days after the meeting when the man appeared at her doorstep, his posture calm but firm. He stood there, his hands loosely by his sides, and looked at her without saying a word at first. Karen opened the door, trying to maintain a neutral expression, but her mind was racing. I know you're upset, the man said, finally breaking the silence. And I understand that you want what's best for the community. But I need you to understand something. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to live my life. I've worked hard for what I have, and I'm not going to let anyone dictate how I use my property. Karen crossed her arms, her gaze steady. She had expected a confrontation, but she wasn't prepared for the calmness in his voice. It's not about dictating you. Or life, she said firmly. It's about respecting the rules. The community has a right to use the lake, and the HOA is in place to make sure everyone follows the same guidelines. It's not just about you and your property, it's about all of us. The man sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. I get that, but there's a limit to what I'm willing to compromise on. I don't mind sharing the lake, but I'm not going to let you or anyone else tell me how to run my own property. Karen knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy. She had been prepared for the man to be stubborn, but now, standing in front of him, she realized just how deep his resolve ran. She wasn't used to being challenged like this. For so long, she had been the one who made the decisions, the one who set the tone in the neighborhood. But now here was someone who didn't just follow the rules, he made his own. Look, Karen began, her voice a little softer now. I'm not trying to make your life harder. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. We live in a community. We have to be able to respect each other, and that includes respecting the space we all share. The man nodded slowly. I respect the community, he said, but I also need to protect my rights. I've been here long enough to know that people in this neighborhood like their peace and quiet. I'm not trying to ruin that, but I need to make sure that what's mine stays mine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Karen could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about a boat or the lake anymore. It was about power, about control, and about finding a balance between individual rights and the needs of the community. She had spent so much time focused on the rules, on maintaining order, that she hadn't considered the other side of the story. Finally, after what felt like a long silence, the man spoke again. "I've been thinking about this," he said, "and I've decided that I'm willing to make a compromise. I'll move the boat to a different spot, away from the entrance so it doesn't block access for others, but I'm not going to let anyone push me around. I'll follow the guidelines that make sense, but I won't be told how to live my life." Karen stood there, surprised by the shift in tone. This wasn't the confrontation she had been expecting. Instead, it was a tentative step toward resolution. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was a start. She felt a sense of relief wash over her, tempered with the realization that this wasn't a complete victory. It was a compromise. "Thank you," she said quietly, her arms uncrossing. "I appreciate you being willing to work with us. I just want what's best for the community. We need to find a way to coexist." The man gave a small nod. "I get it. And I'm willing to try. But don't expect me to roll over for anyone." Karen smiled, though it was a little strained. "I wouldn't expect that," she said. "But we'll make it work." Over the next few days, the man kept his word. He moved his boat to a different area, far enough away from the entrance to allow the other residents to access the lake freely. Karen noticed the change when she passed by his property one afternoon. The boat was now docked at the far edge of the water, out of the way but still visible from the shore. As the days passed, Karen found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She had spent so much time focused on maintaining control, on making sure everyone followed the rules, that she had almost forgotten the importance of compromise. The man hadn't just accepted her demands, he had shown her that sometimes the best way forward wasn't about winning, but about finding common ground. The community continued to function as it always had, with the lake still serving as a place of peace and recreation. The fishing club returned to the water, grateful for the space to fish without the obstruction of the boat. Slowly, life returned to normal, but something had changed. Karen's role in the community had shifted. She had always seen herself as the enforcer, the one who made sure everyone complied with the rules. But now she understood that sometimes compromise was just as important as authority. The man, who had been an outsider just a few months ago, was now part of the community in a way that no one had anticipated. He wasn't the enemy anymore. He was just another resident, trying to live his life in his own way, just like everyone else. And Karen had learned something valuable from him, that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't always about getting your way, but about understanding the other person's perspective. In the weeks that followed, Karen found herself more relaxed. She still took her role in the community seriously, but she had learned to let go of some of her need for control. She had seen that when people were willing to listen to each other, when they were willing to find a way to compromise, things could work out better than they ever could have if everyone had just stuck to their guns. One evening, as Karen walked by the lake, she saw the man out on his boat again, enjoying the water as the sun set behind him. She smiled to herself, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling her. Maybe it hadn't been the perfect solution, but it was a solution nonetheless, and in the end that was all that really mattered. The weeks that followed were quiet. The man had kept his word and moved his boat to a different spot, out of the way, and life in the community began to return to normal. Karen couldn't deny that there was a part of her that felt a sense of relief. The tension that had hung in the air for so long had finally lifted. People were using the lake again, the fishing club had resumed their activities, and the neighborhood had returned to its peaceful rhythm. But, as much as things seemed to settle, Karen couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of unease. While the surface had smoothed over, there were still lingering questions in her mind. Had the compromise really been enough? Had the man truly learned to respect the community, or had he simply given in to avoid further conflict? Karen couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty ate at her in ways she hadn't expected. One evening, as she walked past the lake, she saw the man again. He was on his boat just as he had been before, gliding through the water with ease. The sight of him there, so calm and unbothered, made Karen pause for a moment. She had been watching him from a distance for weeks now, but this time something felt different. She had fought so hard to get him to cooperate, But now that things were settled, she wasn't sure how to feel about it. She had won, but what had she really gained? Karen didn't like that feeling. She didn't like uncertainty, and she certainly didn't like feeling like she had to second-guess herself. After everything that had happened, she still wanted to make sure that the community was running smoothly. She wanted to make sure that the man, despite his willingness to compromise, wasn't still a loose end waiting to unravel everything. It was then that Karen had an idea. Maybe the situation wasn't over. Maybe there was more to be done. A way to ensure that everyone could coexist peacefully without any lingering tension. But this time, instead of fighting for control, she would try a different approach. She would reach out to the man one last time and see if there was a way to move forward without the constant underlying sense of conflict. The next day, Karen called him. She had debated for a while about whether or not it was the right thing to do, but in the end, she realized that the only way to fully resolve things was to talk it through. It wasn't about the boat anymore. It was about finding common ground and making sure they both understood each other, not just on the surface but on a deeper level. When he answered the phone, his voice was warm but still cautious. "Hello?" "Hi," Karen said, her tone friendly but purposeful. "It's Karen from the neighborhood. I was wondering if we could talk for a few minutes. I'd like to discuss a few things if you have the time." There was a brief pause before he replied. "Sure, I've got some time this afternoon. What's on your mind?" "Thank you," Karen said, relieved that he was willing to talk. "I just wanted to check in to see how things have been going with the lake and the boat. I know we've had our differences, but I think it's important for both of us to make sure we're on the same page moving forward." "I agree," he said. "I've been thinking about it too. I don't want any more tension between us or the community. Things have been fine, but I know there's still some lingering feelings from the whole situation." "Exactly," Karen said, "and that's what I wanted to address. I don't want anyone to feel like there's unresolved tension. I think it's important for us to come to a clear understanding about what we both need from this. You have your property, and I have the community I'm responsible for. But we don't have to be enemies." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Karen wasn't sure what he was thinking, but she could feel the weight of the conversation. This was more than just a quick chat. It was an opportunity to bridge the gap between them, to ensure that the community remained united and that the man felt respected, not pushed around. "You're right," the man said after a moment. "I've been thinking the same thing. Honestly, I didn't realize how much it would affect everyone when I first moved here. I thought I was just enjoying my property, but I see now that there are other people who care about it too, and I don't want to be the reason for any more conflict." Karen felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had been worried that he would be defensive, that the conversation would turn into another argument, but instead he seemed genuinely willing to work together. "I appreciate you saying that, Karen," replied. "And I want you to know that I don't see you as the problem. We just need to make sure we're all on the same page. I think there's a way for everyone to enjoy the lake, and I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of what makes this community special." "I agree," the man said. "I've been enjoying the peace here more than I thought I would. I don't want to jeopardize that. I just don't want to feel like I'm being forced into something, you know?" Karen nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I understand, and I'm not trying to force anything on you. I just want to make sure we can all get along without stepping on each other's toes. We all deserve to enjoy the lake in our own way, without anyone feeling like their rights are being ignored." The conversation continued, each of them carefully navigating the delicate balance between community and personal space. They spoke about how the lake could be used by everyone without one person feeling like they had more control than the other. They agreed that the boat's new spot was working, and they discussed ways to ensure that everyone could access the water without any issues. It wasn't just about compromise anymore. It was about understanding, about respecting each other's needs. As the conversation drew to a close, Karen felt a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the confrontation she had expected, nor was it the victory she had hoped for. Instead, it was something far more important, a resolution that came from mutual respect and understanding. She had learned that sometimes the best way to move forward was not by asserting authority, but by listening, by compromising, and by finding a solution that worked for everyone. "I'm glad we talked," Karen said, her voice sincere. "I think this is the beginning of something better. Thank you for being open to the conversation." "Thank you," the man replied. "I think this will make things better for everyone." After they hung up, Karen felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. The situation wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. The community had been through a lot, but now there was a chance for real harmony. She had learned that sometimes you didn't need to be in charge to make things work. Sometimes all it took was a willingness to listen and a desire to find a common goal. As the sun set that evening, Karen stood by the lake, watching the man's boat glide silently through the water. It was a peaceful sight, one that reminded her that despite all the conflict and tension, there was still beauty in the world. And sometimes the best way to protect that beauty was by letting go of control and allowing others to share in it. As the weeks passed, the community seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Karen had made peace with the man who owned the lake, and they had reached an understanding that allowed everyone to enjoy the shared space without any more conflict. The boat was no longer a problem. The fishing club had resumed their regular visits, and the neighborhood had returned to its peaceful, quiet existence. But even with everything seeming fine on the surface, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper she needed to address. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that what had happened between her and the man wasn't just about the boat. It was about the way people interacted in the community. She had learned a valuable lesson in compromise and listening, but she knew that the rest of the neighborhood needed to learn the same lesson. Karen had always been the one who held everything together. She had been the one to enforce the rules, to make sure everyone followed the HOA's guidelines. But now she realized that the true strength of the community didn't come from her control. It came from the people themselves. And that meant creating an environment where people didn't feel like they had to fight for their space, where everyone's needs were taken into consideration. She spent a lot of time reflecting on this new perspective, and eventually she came to the conclusion that she needed to start a new initiative. It wasn't enough to just let things go back to the way they were. She wanted to build a stronger sense of connection among the residents, to help them understand that they were all part of something bigger than just their individual homes. She wanted to make sure that everyone felt like they had a voice, that they could come together to resolve problems before they escalated into something more. One afternoon, as Karen was walking through the neighborhood, she stopped to chat with a few of the residents. They were mostly older couples who had lived in the area for years, and they were eager to catch up. As they talked about the weather and their families, Karen brought up the idea she had been thinking about, a community meeting to discuss ways to improve communication and cooperation. "We've had a lot of changes lately," Karen said, "and I think it's a good time to come together and make sure we're all on the same page. I want to make sure everyone feels heard and that we're all working together to make this a better place for everyone." The residents listened intently, and Karen could see that they were open to the idea. She explained that the meeting would be an opportunity to discuss any concerns, share ideas, and come up with solutions as a group. It wouldn't be about rules or enforcing authority. It would be about building a sense of community. By the end of the conversation, the residents had all agreed to attend the meeting. Karen was excited but also nervous. She wasn't sure how it would go, but she felt like this was the right step toward making things better. A few days later, Karen hosted the meeting at the community center. She had sent out invitations to everyone in the neighborhood, hoping that as many people as possible would show up. The room was packed, and Karen felt a wave of excitement mixed with nerves as she stood in front of the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but warm. "I know things have been a little tense lately, but I believe we can make this neighborhood an even better place if we work together. This meeting is about all of us, about creating a space where everyone feels heard and respected. It's not about enforcing rules or taking sides. It's about finding ways to improve our community for everyone." The room was quiet, and Karen could feel the weight of the moment. She wasn't used to being so vulnerable, but she knew that this was the right approach. She had spent too much time trying to control everything, and now it was time to let go and allow the residents to share their thoughts. "I want to start by hearing from you," Karen said, encouraging the group to speak. "What are your concerns? What do you think we could improve here in the neighborhood?" For the next hour, the room was filled with discussions. Some people spoke about small issues like the need for more streetlights or better maintenance of the common areas. Others brought up bigger concerns like the sense of isolation that had crept into the community over the years. People wanted more opportunities to connect, to feel like they were part of something. As the conversation continued, Karen felt a sense of relief. It was clear that the residents cared about each other, even if they hadn't always expressed it. They all wanted the same thing, to live in a neighborhood where they felt safe, respected, and connected. And that was exactly what Karen had hoped for. By the end of the meeting, they had come up with several ideas for improving the community. They decided to start a neighborhood newsletter to keep everyone informed about upcoming events and important issues. They also agreed to set up regular meetups where people could come together to socialize and discuss whatever was on their minds. And they decided to create a community committee, made up of volunteers, that would focus on improving communication and addressing concerns as they arose. As Karen wrapped up the meeting, she felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had started this process with the hope that the community could find a way to work together. And now, it was happening. People were talking to each other, sharing ideas, and looking for ways to make their neighborhood stronger. It wasn't about one person enforcing rules. It was about everyone taking responsibility for the community they shared. Over the next few months, the changes were evident. The newsletter became a regular part of life, and the meetups were a huge success. People were getting to know each other better, and the sense of isolation that had once plagued the neighborhood began to fade. The community committee proved to be an invaluable resource, helping to resolve issues before they became bigger problems. As for Karen, she found herself feeling more at ease. She was still a part of the neighborhood, still someone who cared deeply about making it a better place, but she no longer felt the weight of having to control everything. She had learned that leadership wasn't about being in charge. It was about bringing people together, listening to their concerns and helping them find solutions. One evening, as Karen walked by the lake again, she saw the man who had once been at the center of the conflict. He was sitting on the dock watching the sunset, and Karen couldn't help but smile. The tension between them had faded, and there was now a quiet understanding between them. They didn't need to be friends, but they had found a way to coexist peacefully, and that was enough. As Karen stood there, taking in the view, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come a long way from the woman who had been so focused on rules and authority. She had learned that true strength came from connection, from people working together and from understanding each other's perspectives. The community wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that was all that mattered. As the months passed, the changes in the neighborhood became more and more apparent. Karen watched as the sense of community that had once felt fragmented slowly came together. The meetups were flourishing, the newsletter was well received, and more residents were taking part in neighborhood events. The fishing club was still a big part of the lake's appeal, but now there was a broader sense of cooperation. People were no longer just isolated in their individual homes. They were connecting in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't perfect, but Karen was beginning to see the fruits of her efforts. She had always believed that a community could only thrive if the people within it worked together. In the past, she had been so focused on managing everything, on keeping things under control, that she hadn't realized that true leadership was about empowering others. And now it seemed like the entire neighborhood was embracing that idea. But there was still one lingering question in Karen's mind. She had done a lot of work to foster this newfound sense of unity, but how would it hold up over time? People were starting to care about each other again, but there were always challenges when it came to maintaining that. Would the neighborhood continue to grow together, or would old habits return? Karen knew she couldn't control everything, but she hoped that the foundation they had built would be strong enough to carry them forward. One evening, as the sun was setting over the lake, Karen took a walk to clear her head. It had been a long week of meetings, organizing events, and working on various projects for the community. She had been feeling a bit overwhelmed, trying to balance everything. But as she walked along the shore, breathing in the crisp evening air, she found a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't know what she was expecting that evening, but she certainly hadn't expected to see him there, the man who had once challenged everything Karen had worked for. He was sitting on a bench by the lake, staring out over the water, just as he had been when they had first met. At first, Karen wasn't sure what to do. She could feel the familiar tension creeping back into her chest, a reminder of all the struggles they had been through. But then she took a deep breath and decided to approach him. They had already come a long way since their initial confrontation. Maybe this was an opportunity to finally clear the air between them, to put the past behind them completely. "Hey," Karen said, her voice hesitant but friendly. The man turned toward her, and for a moment they simply stood there, looking at each other. There was no animosity in his gaze, just the quiet understanding that had developed over time. "Karen," he said, nodding slightly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same," she replied, smiling. "I was just taking a walk." For a few moments they stood there in silence, the only sound being the gentle ripples of the lake. Karen wasn't sure how to start, but she knew she had to say something. "You know," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking about everything that happened with the boat, and about how much it changed the neighborhood." The man shifted slightly, looking out over the water as he spoke. "I think it changed me too. When I first moved in, I didn't realize how much I would have to consider everyone else. I thought I was just here to enjoy my property, but there's a lot more to it than that." Karen felt a sense of relief. Hearing him say that made her realize just how much they had both grown since that initial conflict. There had been so much tension, so much uncertainty, but now, they were finally having a conversation without the weight of that struggle hanging over them. "I don't think any of us really realized how much we needed to work together," Karen said. "I spent so much time trying to keep everything in order. But I've learned that it's not about controlling things. It's about giving people the space to share their ideas and make decisions together." He nodded, taking in her words. "Yeah, I can see that now. I've always been independent, focused on my own space, but I've come to realize that you can't just live in a bubble. You have to consider the people around you." Karen smiled, feeling the tension between them dissolve completely. They had both come to the same conclusion, though it had taken different paths to get there. "I think the community is better for it," Karen said. "People are starting to come together in ways they didn't before. The events, the meetups, it's been amazing to watch." The man chuckled, glancing at the peaceful water. "I'm glad I could be a part of that. I never thought I'd say it, but I'm starting to enjoy the company of the other residents." Karen laughed. "I'm sure that wasn't easy at first." "No, it wasn't," he admitted. "But I think I finally realized that living here is about more than just owning the lake. It's about being part of something bigger." They stood there for a moment longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Karen knew that they had both changed since their first interaction, but it was clear that the changes weren't just surface level. The man had learned to open up, to recognize the importance of the community. And Karen had learned to let go, to give people the freedom to contribute without feeling like she had to control everything. "You know," the man said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about the fishing club. I know I said I wouldn't interfere, but I think I can help out. Maybe we can make it even better, find ways to include more people, more activities." Karen's eyes widened in surprise. "You'd do that?" He shrugged, a sheepish grin on his face. "Yeah, I think it could be fun. Besides, I've been enjoying it myself more than I thought I would." Karen couldn't help but smile. This was the change she had hoped for. Not just in him, but in the entire community. It wasn't about one person's victory or defeat. It was about everyone coming together, working toward a common goal. "I think that's a great idea," Karen said. "The more people we get involved, the better." The conversation shifted from the fishing club to other neighborhood ideas, ways they could make the lake even more accessible, how to continue improving communication between the residents. As they talked, Karen felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about resolving a conflict anymore. This was about building something stronger, something that would last. As the evening sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting an orange glow over the lake, Karen realized how far they had come. There had been moments of frustration, of tension, but they had worked through it together. And in the process, they had built something that wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding each other, about supporting each other. "I'm glad we talked," Karen said, her voice calm and sincere. "Me too," the man replied. "It's nice to know we're on the same page." They stood there for a while longer, watching the last light of day fade over the water. Karen felt at peace, knowing that the community had become stronger, that the people in it had learned to respect one another in a way they hadn't before. The future didn't seem as uncertain anymore. There would be challenges, of course, but Karen knew they could face them together. As she walked back home that evening, Karen realized that it wasn't just about the lake, or the boat, or even the community itself. It was about the people who made it what it was, their willingness to change, to grow, and to work together for something bigger than themselves. And that, she thought with a smile, was worth all the effort.